Thank you, Adam, and thanks everyone for still being here despite of the wine outside. I'm sure that is more exciting than to hear about Brexit again. I'm going to try and make this very focused and as possibly relevant as possible. That's a beautiful sentence there for you, in terms of the topic of today's talk. It will be slightly easier thanks to Jana, because she's spoken about the issue of participation already. And I would like to add two more things, and I would love to hear Carol's opinion later about this, that I think we are sort of, I kind of miss from today's debates. And the first one is, what is the role of citizens in all of this? You know, let's change the voting and electoral system. Let's be more inclusive. Let's give them more options. Are we going to ask citizens about those options first? Or are we just going to introduce them as elites who know better? Maybe, I don't know. And the other issue that I would like to talk about or bring to attention, and I will try and focus it again, is the issue of identity politics. We haven't really spoken about identity politics today yet. And I think if we are looking at Europe and European politics, whether in the Czech Republic or in Hungary, where I'm originally from, or in Norway, where I'm about to go to, or in the UK, where I'm leaving as we speak, identity politics matter. And actually, identity politics is the issue that seems to drive the day forwards. And now I don't know what button to press or not to press. Okay, thank you. Yeah, one, twice. Yes, and that's exactly what I would like to start today, if that's possible. So, as Adam, thankfully, gratefully, noted that I work in sort of European politics, broadly speaking. Well, when we look at European politics, what we look at is how Europe is driven forward, at least today, from an identity issue for citizens. Does it appeal to their emotions? Does it appeal to their identity aspect of whether, you know, I call myself Hungarian and European, or just European, or just Hungarian, which means possibly the exclusion of a European issue? And this is, I would like to argue, is basically the sort of hotbed of why or how Brexit has come about. If you look at the UK, and I'm sorry I'm going to use the UK as an example, but you know, we can talk about other examples later. Actually, what you see in sort of a longer distance, from a longer time perspective, is how its role in the globe has been always or tended to be defined as in relation to something else, and not something else, i.e. Europe, but something else to the US, to the ex-Commonwealth countries and to the empire. So that is part of the way in which the identity there was sort of framed to begin with. And so, 2016, the referendum on in-out, simple choice referendum on in-out, staying in Europe or not, we have a very divided country as a result. As I think the map shows perfectly well how exclusionary those type of options can be. When you have a binary vote, you get a divided country, potentially. And this is an example for the EU referendum now, but if you go back to, for example, the constitutional referendum in 2005, or if we go back to actually the very first time the idea or the issue of citizenship was introduced at the European level, which is through the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. We already had the first referendum in Europe from Denmark vetoing the very idea of citizenship at the European level. So here is another figure just to illustrate. These are not my figures. I pinched them from the UK in a Changing Europe, an amazingly informal site for you to, if you're interested in the topic, to look at, which again shows how divided, not just in terms of identity, sort of the British public has been, but also in terms of their identity, and then as a result of that, their preferences on Europe. So, for example, those who are identified as European only, of course, largely supported Remain, but 80% didn't actually go to vote. Looking at the Scottish-only identity group, they are the largest who supported Remain, 45% supported Remain. But quite a majority, quite a big portion, 32 actually, also supported the Leave option. So what I'm trying to say here, I guess, is that Brexit was an identity signifier even before all this mess about the negotiations started out. And since then, it has become even more so. If you're interested in the topic or if you're interested in this issue, Sarah Hobolt at LSE has done a lot of surveys and sort of more representative information on this. What I would like to have or sort of move on to that we haven't really covered, and we haven't really covered in terms of the national news potentially either, is what happened on the ground as a result of the vote. And in particular, I want to focus on those alternative voices. And I think that's kind of relevant to the issue that is brought about today about D21 and the opportunity to bring in more options, let's say. And in particular, we've had examples where, for the first time, we have 6 million people in a national referendum supporting a pro-European position. But of course, on the other end of the argument, we also have 600,000 people just before March supporting a no-deal Brexit, even before quite understanding what a no-deal means. So I'm going to skip that. So in this context, I've been basically researching how Brexit is reflected upon by citizens and citizen activists, and in particular, because I'm interested in their role, civil society activists and civil society organizations. As well as, being a Hungarian in the UK, I also have interviewed Central and Eastern European residents in there. Today, I'm only going to focus on the civil society aspect, but you know, I'm always happy and would be happy to talk about the other side if you're interested. So I will give you a couple of examples, anecdotes from what people have told me, from the things that wouldn't necessarily appear in a referendum or an electoral debate that you tend to hear about in the news. And the first point is to go back to the very first point I made when I started this conversation or my presentation, is that identity matters. And in particular here, community identity matters. So it goes back very nicely again to what Jana was talking about earlier, about how communities can come together. And an example from a Remainer activist, one of my friends said to me, to do with the leaving, and she said to me, does any of this really affect you? Well, no, it doesn't affect me, but that isn't the point. This is about thinking about my neighbor or people in the community, the children, my sister's children, and so on. It's a view by some people that if it doesn't affect you, then it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, I did this interview sometime in March. More and more people, of course, move to the, well, it doesn't really affect us, let's just get on with it. Brexit is taking up all our time. But of course, when we look slightly closely in terms of the divisions that have emerged, we get two different views on what the community is really about. From Leaver's side, community is about being English and being good to your neighbor, which then means potentially that you don't just let in anyone, but you let in those who are good for your community. By comparison, for Remainers, quite often being part of a community also means being part of the European community. And so they find the Brexit suicide vote quite detrimental to the community that they defined to start with, and they don't really know where to go from next. One thing, though, that both of these activists and these organizations tend to agree on, so I also did discourse analysis with some of the leaflets and some of the websites and some of the sort of mobilization, let's say, marketing that they have produced. The one thing everyone seems to agree upon is that the EU needs reforming. So if we are looking for a consensus, bless you, good timing, if we are looking for a consensus in terms of Brexit in the UK, is that the EU needs reforming of some kind. Should we put that to a vote? I mean, is using the term reform, and I'm going to give you an example with the next one, is that actually already problematic? Is giving too many options for reform problematic in itself? Because then you already say there is something wrong with the EU in this case, or the UK's membership in the EU. Of course, the focus was largely on free movement. Again, going back to sort of the 2004 enlargement and the UK's role in it and open migration policies and so on. Nobody talks about that part. Everyone says the EU needs reforming its free movement policies. But we need to put that into context, of course. Another issue that they tended to agree upon is that they are just not happy with British politicians. So, you know, Boris Johnson has come to the scene fairly recently, and of course, he's a quite divisive figure on his own, right? However, or thankfully, whichever side you're sitting upon in terms of the argument, actually politicians seem to mobilize these grassroots activists and civil societies even more. So the more divisive a political figure is, the more active these members of civil society tended to become. So for example, a Leave supporter, vote Leave member, I think some people go into politics to raise themselves up. They've got self-interest rather than working for the people who have elected them. And it makes me very cross. Now, if you're not British, you don't realize that's a very strong way of saying, I don't approve. But that's what she's saying here. Now that obviously many members of parliament who are elected to do the best they can for the people in their community who have elected them are now all joining together and trying to rebel about what we are trying to do, to leave. The vote was to leave, and I would despise the way some of them are working. But lucky for her, we now have a prime minister who is saying we are going to leave. And it's sort of the same sort of notes come about constantly. And I really hope that from a couple of the examples that I've given you, the other issue that seems to sort of emerge, not just as a consensus, but in terms of motivation, is the role of emotions and how emotional Brexit, and as an identity signifier, how emotional these activists have become. Depression or euphoria, slightly bad use of word there, you know, seem to be at the heart of why these activists are active, despite of Brexit going on for 2 years, 3 years, potentially 4 years, as we speak now. And so why does this matter? I'm here in Prague and I'm talking about Brexit in the UK. Well, we have heard, and I tend to, every time I look on the news websites or if I look at an academic article, we put Brexit into, it's another example of populism. It's like Trump, it's like Viktor Orban. But it really isn't, or just saying that is not enough. And I think that's one of the points that I would like to raise here. Is that when we are talking about populism in Europe, wherever you are talking about it, you need to consider, or we need to consider as experts and as sort of practitioners, you know, what makes that case distinctive, what makes it interesting, what makes it sort of stand out. And in the case of Brexit, I really strongly would like to argue that just saying it's populism, that's not enough. We need to look closely. Some of the issues that have been longer standing in terms of the UK being, for example, an outlier case have been reproduced recently. We have also an issue of collective identity mobilization that we are not talking about, which can be, of course, positive if you are a pro-European. For the first time, we have articulation of having an EU right in the political campaigns and in the media. But at the same time, we also have clear criticisms about where Europe is heading in the headlines, in the center of discussions. So with this sort of two exemplary aspects of Brexit, identity politics and sort of activism, we can see where European politics seems to be heading. And this is nothing new. As I said earlier, examples in terms of, for example, the Maastricht referendum, referendum on the Maastricht Treaty in Denmark back in '93. This is not the first time we had a negative vote about where Europe is heading and how then civil societies or citizens are reflecting upon. But what I would like to maybe end on a cautious note now is that we haven't really seen an expansion. So we've seen an expansion of identity politics and we've seen an expansion of participation from citizens. We haven't seen an expansion of scale for or inclusion of these types of opinions, of participations to be integrated, not at the British political level or the European political level. And this could be something that will come about not just in Britain, of course, but in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, in Austria, wherever we have traces or examples for or potential for similarly divisive politics to emerge. And I'm going to stop there, I think. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siklodi. We do in space for a couple of questions. Yeah, Tuma, the lady at the back. Yeah.
Hi. So I thought the anecdotes you had were interesting, but you know, none of the data about the results of the potential results of leaving comports with people's feeling about it. Like what people are experiencing doesn't seem to match what actually would happen as a consequence. And some, you know, the old, they're voting against their own self-interest, I guess, without knowing it. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that, because I hear people's stories, but since it doesn't seem to be actually true. I mean, meaning, you know, people were worried about job loss, let's say, because of immigration, and the data doesn't suggest that that had happened. Or I'm saying, people's experience don't actually reflect what the data has showed.
No, I agree. I totally agree. I mean, this is why I started out by saying identity politics is something that we seem to have not talked about today. But that's where, or the issue of emotions, and when they drive participation and when they drive decision-making, there is very little space left for rationally thinking through what happens. So, for example, as part of this, and please note, these are just indicative interviews, let's say. I mean, this is not generalizable among all activists and among all Remainers or Leavers. But the point here, and I know that others who have done similar studies with civil society organizations have found the same, is that when I give examples to either Leavers or Remainers on why the other side might have voted in a certain way, they just shut down. There is just no interest, there is no discussion, because it's such an emotional, polarizing issue now. So I'm afraid I'm not sure how to resolve that. That's something for perhaps a D21 option, where we can identify different options. I'm not sure if we can.
Lovely. And one last question from the audience. No? Okay, if there isn't a question, then I actually have a question, because that was a fascinating talk, and I'm fascinated by identity politics, as you described. I think it's a very, very important topic. And one thing that strikes me, at least what my impression is, and I would like to ask you if you can see it reflected in the data, is that it seems that nowadays people identify with their political position far more strongly than they used to. Whereas, say, in the past, you could have a preference for a particular party, but what mattered for you that you were, I don't know, a good father, or you were good at your job, and so on. And now it seems that the political aspect of people's lives seem far more important when it comes to identifying who we are as people. Would you say that that's happening, or is it just a wrong impression?
I would never say anything is wrong. I would perhaps say that identity politics, or sort of political identity, let's say, has a different scale in which it's now being represented or being given voice to. And so that's exactly what we see, for example, with Brexit, because Brexit has now become an issue that cross-cuts party affiliations. See the Labour Party, see the Conservatives. I mean, they are losing MPs left, right, and centre. It's just amazing to view how the British party system, or political system, one of the most lauded in the world, is falling apart as a result of it. But is this something really new? I'm not entirely sure. I think it's just more about, I would argue that it's more about the scale or the opportunities that are given. So it is new in the sense of course, we have now more of an individualization of politics, but this goes back to the 80s, so and we actually heard about this earlier in the morning. So I wouldn't say Brexit is that particularly new, and that's also why I would say it's a warning sign for others, potentially.
Well, thank you very much, and once again, Dr. Nora Siklodi.